Today is one more of those last 5 episodes of the It's Not What They Told You series. It's not just one more episode. It's with someone I hold very, very dear, someone that I consider a teacher in very interesting ways. She didn't know that. She only knew that when I met her right now, because I do spend a lot of time following her work. And I think she's fabulous, honestly, in her outlook on life and the way she analyzes topics. And then I met her in person, and I was right. So that's it's actually quite rewarding when they say don't meet your heroes. No, I'm happy with this one. My guest today is Grace Blakeley, who is an avid economist, journalist, an author. She wrote 3 books on the topics of capitalism and how capitalism is affecting the world. Her latest is Vulture Capitalist, which I have to say, having lived in California for a while, is such an appropriate title for the entire genre of venture capitalist, if you want. And I think in my attempt to get you to understand our world a little differently than what they tell us our world is like, I think Grace truly was the one guest that I wanted to sort of conclude our conversations around the economy with. So without further ado, I'm going to enjoy my time with my guest today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that absolutely lovely introduction, Mo. It means a huge amount, especially coming from you.
It's quite true. So I no pressure. Okay.
Yeah. I'm hoping I won't disappoint you now. Let's see.
I don't think you will. I love the way the take you take on the topics that you analyze. And I said several times on this podcast, I am a recovering capitalist, in rehab, basically. Because for many, many, many years, I believed the promise. I drank the Kool-Aid. I had many startups. I basically embraced the promise of freedom. That, if you think to the history of capitalism and the idea that pre-capitalism there was only royalty and feudalism, and there were peasants and lords, and everyone had to pay to work for the for the lords, and the lords worked for the royalty, and capitalism sort of sneaked in with the British Empire and the trades of spices and so on, where some of the peasants somehow found ways to make money. And you sort of take that story as like, this is true freedom. Everyone now is free. I've then realized, actually partially through your work, that that's not true at all. That we're the furthest thing, as the subtitle of your latest book says, this is the death of freedom, that the promise is not at all what was delivered. So that's all I will say today. The rest of the episode is for you.
Great. I'll try and take up as much time as I can. No, I mean, it's so interesting hearing you say that, because in a lot of ways, I kind of wrote the book for someone like you who was in one way or another taken in by the very seductive narrative that we have around capitalism and freedom. And it's a seductive narrative in a number of ways. I think for those who succeed under capitalism, it's very seductive because the idea that we're all free and that the market sorts us into the best down to the worst, and wherever you end up in the hierarchy is a reflection of your natural talents, your natural capabilities. It's seductive, obviously, for those at the top because it kind of legitimizes your power and authority and wealth. And even for those not at the top, the idea that the way things are is somehow rational and justified and fair, it makes you almost less angry. It kind of makes you just take things the way they are and just accept them, because you think, oh, well, I'm not Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. I'm not as intelligent as those people. So no wonder, I'm earning a tiny amount of money and can barely afford to pay my rent because I'm just worth somehow less as a person. So this narrative that we are all free, we're free to shape the conditions of our own existence, we're free to work as hard as we like, and if we do work as hard as we like and succeed and apply ourselves, then we will inevitably rise to the top. It's seductive for a lot of people. The only issue is that it's completely and utterly not true. And the way I like to talk about this, we're told this kind of story about the way that society works as it almost being like a game. So, you're competing against other people to win the game, and the rewards are money and wealth and power and esteem. And those who are better at the game get to the top, and those who are worse, fall to the bottom. But the issue is that we're all playing this game, most of us. And then there's a very small category of people who are kind of outside of the game. And instead of playing the game, they're making the rules.
They're the game
for
makers.
Everyone else.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these are the people who basically plan capitalist economies, the institutions and individuals who have so much power over the way that the world works that they're able to basically shape the conditions of life for so many people. And that power is generally unearned. It, comes from whether that's a position of inherited wealth. Often it comes from corruption and influence of that kind that people are able to exert. And it allows a small number of people to undermine that idea of freedom and to enclose the world and shape the world in the way that they would like to see it. And then we're all forced to play the game that they've set for us. I use quite a lot of examples to illustrate this point, that, this idea that we live in a free market capitalist economy doesn't really work in practice because of all this kind of centralized planning that takes place within these free market economies. And the one I'd just like to quickly talk about, because it's very relevant at the moment, is the example of the company Boeing.
Oh, yes.
So you might have seen Boeing in the news quite a lot recently. One of the doors blew out of its planes mid-flight. There's been all sorts of engineering issues with the company. And actually, if you look back to 2018-19, there were 2 crashes involving Boeing planes, the 737 MAX disasters, in which
400 people or something.
nearly 350 people died. Yeah. And initially, Boeing tried to kind of blame the pilots for both of these crashes. But investigations later revealed that it had been a software flaw that was kind of built into the plane that caused the plane's nose to dive down, and the pilot could not really do anything to rectify the issue. And subsequent investigation from both regulators and journalists looking into this showed that a big factor in kind of demonstrating why Boeing had allowed this basically unsafe plane to go to market was that it had shifted towards this corporate culture of basically denigrating engineering expertise, lionizing senior management, inserting layers and layers and layers of management whose role it was to cut costs, crush unions, kind of subjugate workers, ignore whistleblowers, and just deliver cheap planes that could be sold to Boeing's various network of contracts that exists with governments all over the world, not least the American state, and make massive profits. And they did that. They were able to achieve massive, massive profits, distributed loads of money to shareholders. And it was kind of, a classic tale of corporate greed in which you didn't see any kind of competitive pressure from the alleged free markets because Boeing was in this position of basically kind of oligopoly power. Exactly. Yeah. And equally, you have other people who might say, oh, well, if the government was able to kind of step in and, make the market fairer or subject this firm to regulation, then this never would have happened. There's only one issue with that, which is that the government was helping Boeing at every step.
Yeah.
So it was one of the biggest recipients of corporate welfare. That means it got money from the government, from the US state in terms of taxes, subsidies. It had huge numbers of contracts with the US state. It was a very integral part of the military-industrial complex. In terms of regulation, at the time of these disasters, the airlines, so the aerospace manufacturers were being regulated in the same way as the banks in the run-up to the 2008 financial crisis. This is self-regulation.
Yeah.
And Boeing was being regulated by a unit of the Federal Aviation Authority that sat inside Boeing and whose workers were being paid by Boeing. Yes. Congress had just passed another round of deregulation for the airline industry, saying that no manufacturer would ever release a plane that was unsafe because it would damage its position in the market. Capitalism would never allow such a thing to happen because we have free market competition. And then even after all of this had come to light and Boeing was charged because of all of these failings, it still got a massive backdoor bailout during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there you have this kind of cabal of senior executives, wealthy shareholders, politicians, individuals within a powerful state who are brought together in something like the military-industrial complex and who are entirely insulated from free market competition and also actually quite well insulated from democracy as well. So they exist in their own little bubble at the very top, able to make these massive decisions that have huge effects for everyone else. And yet we're told that we live in this free market system. Boeing's workers were subject to this ruthless market.
Yes.
But the executives at the top
weren't. But not
weren't.
the top. So, of course, Boeing has a very privileged, important position, let's say, for the U.S. economy because the competitor is Airbus, which is not American, which basically means that if Boeing fails, the U.S. economy fails, or the U.S. position in aerospace fails, and or commercial aerospace fails. And accordingly, the American government would never let them fail, if you want, right? It's very, very similar to the analogy of 2008 and the big banks, right? Too big to fail, if you want. Now, of course, the interesting side of this is that basically it means that we are asking the regulators, we want the government, if you want to say capitalism is freedom because everyone can do what they can to succeed without government regulation, the Reagan economics, if you want, what Thatcher allowed to do, tried to do here in the UK or pretended to do here in the UK, is basically saying, hold on, no regulation from the government, it's freedom for the market economy. And at the same time, now when we ask the government to regulate, by definition, there is really none of that because the benefits there is a conflict of interest around the benefits. So that's a very, very, there is really no freedom, if you want. When you think about how we end up in places like this, so we constantly hear the words around, those big influencers somewhere who own all the money, or own all the wealth, who are making all the decisions, in a way that basically affects every single one of us. How does that actually play in reality? I mean, is there really a backdoor meeting where people worth less than $100 million are not allowed in that meeting, and the others come together and say, okay, from now on we're going to start another pandemic, and that's going to, right? Is that how it happens?
No, generally not. Although there are moments of generally crisis when you do see powerful people come together, often in a room, and make really big decisions about what happens next. So the example I always think about is the financial crisis, when the central banks got together with the heads of the major banks and basically made a plan for the world economy. And there was a study that was done after that showed that those banking institutions that had the closest links with the American state ended up doing better from the bailouts than those that didn't. So, occasionally, and I think this is where the kind of conspiracy theory stuff comes from, you do see powerful people coming together and actively making those decisions in a collective way. But the vast majority of the time, the cooperation is not that explicit and it's not that open. It is the subject of a kind of networked organization that allows people with similar interests to come together to lobby and to influence politicians and political power. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. This is how democracy works. You have different groups of individuals who organize within civil society to make their interests known and try to apply pressure on politicians or whoever else they're trying to pressure. The issue is that we live in a world in which only one set of people have the ability to do that. And the vast majority of people are actively denied the capacity to organize in order to demand things of politicians, and are basically repressed and crushed and beaten down when they try to demand things.
Explain.
So, we talked about neoliberalism, right? About the Thatcher and Reagan, and they're coming to power saying we want to deliver free markets, right? What's very interesting is that the first things that neoliberal leaders do when they come to power is basically go to war with any organizations that manifest collective power, particularly the unions. So in the UK, the first thing that Margaret Thatcher does when she comes to power is go to war with the country's unions. And she wins. She crushes the miners who are trying to fight for their jobs.
Hold on one second. So let's define neoliberalism for everyone.
Oh, sorry.
So
Yeah.
neoliberalism, in my understanding, is government will not regulate. This is free market economics.
Exactly.
Everything happens with the freedom and justice of free market.
Yes.
Government is a burden. Let's leave everything to nature, if you want, the nature of economic free markets.
Exactly.
Right. So of course, Reagan in the US, Thatcher here, were basically the leaders of that idea. Let's go back to the unions bit, which I think is fascinating when you really think about it.
No, that was immensely well explained, because that's exactly how they presented their ideology.
Exactly. That's how they sold the ideology. Yeah.
Exactly. And it was really powerful, I think, because people bought into that idea of freedom and individual freedom.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But what's interesting is the contrast between that promise of freedom, which is we will come to power and we will promote individual freedom. We will give you control over your life.
Your pensions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And then the actual actions of these governments when they come to power. And the first thing they do, as I've said, is, literally use the power of the state to beat back and divide people who are organizing to try and defend their interests. First on the list are the unions. So Reagan famously goes to war with PATCO in the US. Thatcher goes to war with the miners in the UK. And then all of this anti-union legislation is introduced to make it much harder for workers to organise to defend their interests. And so you see union membership decline quite substantially over the course of the next several decades. They also dissolve other forms of collective power that existed in the economy at the time. So Thatcher, for example, shut down the GLC, the Greater London Corporation. And she had been in this kind of battle with the GLC because there were lots of kind of left-wing politicians that were organising in this London Metropolitan Authority to try and do things like, Thatcher wanted to build the London Docklands, right, where we now have Canary Wharf and all of these big financial institutions. The people living there at the time said, we don't want this. They actually put together a document called the People's Plan for the London Docklands with the support of the GLC. And they said, our children deserve to be more than lavatory attendants for passing businessmen. We want a different vision for this space, which is where we live. And partly because of its involvement with community organising like that, Thatcher shut down the GLC. So, any form of community power that it had been helping to support was then crushed as well. So you see these politicians come to power and their first aim is to crush any resistance that comes from the vast mass of ordinary people, right? At the same time, they deliver unparalleled freedom for those at the top. So suddenly you can literally move your money anywhere in the world because you have the removal of capital controls and exchange controls. Tax, especially the taxes that have been levied on those at the very top of society, were slashed. You saw a transformation in regulation. And again, this is often cast as deregulation, which implies that the state is shrinking and stepping back. But that isn't what it was really like. It was actually a proliferation of regulation, but regulation that benefited those at the top, particularly the big banks. Banks need lots of regulation because, they need an environment of certainty. Banks always need to know that ultimately if anything's going to go wrong, then the state is there to bail them out. Exactly. Yeah. So that's why regulation is important to the banking system. And you got, in many ways, lots of new regulation. But instead of regulation to protect workers or protect the environment, it was regulation to protect the banks. So what all this shows, I think, is that neoliberalism was never really about freedom. It was about freedom for some, those at the very top. And in order to protect the freedom, i.e. the wealth and power of those at the top, they saw it as necessary to constrain the freedom of everyone else, yep. And particularly their freedom to organize. And you see this today with demonstrators being put in prison for years for peaceful protest. This is a continuation of the same logic, which is we're putting people in jail to protect freedom. Whose freedom? The freedom of those at the top.
Which is quite fascinating when you really think about it, because that becomes today really the underlying current of everything that you see online, everything that you see. I mean, in a very interesting way, since the Reagan-Thatcher years, individualism, we spoke about this briefly before we started, becomes truly the dream of every now consumer, not human. Okay, the idea is that as a human now in this fair world where dog eats dog, but dog can become very big, and I can be, Jeff Bezos if I really worked hard enough. Suddenly, you start to believe that you're competing with everyone else rather than cooperating with everyone else. Which I have to admit, in my blurry years. I used to, because I'm raised in the East and educated in the West, I used to think that this is something wrong with the West, that individual freedom is highly prioritized above societal and community benefit. Okay. But now I can get it. I can get that this is an agenda that basically says, hey, if all of you guys fight, okay, and argue and be rude to each other, which now is explosive on social media, then you're never going to organize and annoy the rest of us up here in the penthouse trying to just make a little more money here. Exactly.
Yeah. I literally couldn't have put it better myself.
Thank you. My teacher said I was good. So where does that put the politicians then? Because interestingly, you'd look back at the Thatcher years and say, oh my God, it's the best thing that happened to the UK. She was the politician that came and saved all of us, right? And you could actually back that up with years of prosperity in the city of London, if you want, where so much money was being made for so many people and so many Bentleys started to show up on the streets. So there are signs that things are improving. Was Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan actually working for the people? Were they governments of the people or governments of the elite?
Thatcher and Reagan, and Thatcher in particular, actually, had this ingenious strategy. And Thatcher said, the method is economics. The object is to change the soul. She wanted to transform the way that people related to each other in exactly the way that you said. In the 60s and 70s, it was in some ways the peak of organizing. You had a strong labor movement. You'd had, in the US, the peace movement, the protests against Vietnam, the anti-apartheid movement that was spreading around the world and spreading through the student movement. You had the environmental movement. You had all of these people coming together to make their power known. And it was starting to disrupt the operation of capitalism because these people were gaining political power. They were, able to really, present a threat to vested interests. And neoliberalism was what undid that. And it did so through a two-pronged approach. The first one was to create an ultimately unsustainable financial boom, the benefits of which would be used to incentivize people to behave in a certain way. And that's the second prong, which is this project of societal sociological and fundamentally psychological transformation that underpins this transition, which is, as you said, about how do we stop people from organizing together in these movements that are threatening us and get them to start competing against one another. And I'm kind of writing a book proposal at the moment that looks at this exact thing.
I'll publish it.
Great. But the three trends that I think were most pronounced were the shift from workers to entrepreneurs, the shift from citizens to consumers of public services, and the shift from communities to households. So rather than seeing yourself as a worker, as you might have done in the post-war years, Thatcher's aim was to encourage you to see yourself as an entrepreneur, an investor entrepreneur.
Why is that benefit?
And the reason that is particularly beneficial is because workers organize.
Yeah.
They all have the same interests, often.
If they're not paid well, they'll talk to their peer.
Exactly.
And say, hey, are you unable to put food on the table too?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was a problem because these workers were coming together and they were organizing and they were saying, we're not getting paid enough, so let's go on strike. But if you're an entrepreneur and you know this better than anyone, you're competing against all the other entrepreneurs. It's your job to, use your savvy as an investor to invest in your human capital. So this comes out with education. Education is now something that you pay for and you take out a loan to invest in it because it's an investment in capital, in your human capital.
Wow.
You take out a loan to make sure that you're able to purchase your own home. And that, again, can provide a source of wealth that insulates you from life's risks. You, again, get your own private pension and you have to invest that in the stock market. And when the stock market does well, which means wealth is increasing at the top, you then think, oh, well, wealth is being created at the top, but I'm getting a little bit of it as well. So why would I resist? Even if your salary stayed the same, if you have assets, then you're much more likely to identify with the interests of those at the top. Because if the value of your house, the value of your pension is going up, then that means your interests are aligned with those kinds of people. So that shift is really important. And then on the flip side, it's the kind of proliferation of asset ownership is accompanied by this dramatic expansion of debt. Now, debt is the key here because the unleashing of the financial power of the banks is what brings us this boom that creates all of this prosperity, this alleged prosperity that we get from the 1980s onwards. It's largely driven by the removal of exchange controls and the removal of capital controls. So money is now free to flow all over the world, and banks can now create much more money through lending than they had been able to do in the past. A lot of that lending goes into mortgages. It means that you can now take out a massive mortgage and use that to buy a home. What happens when you have more money chasing the same amount of stuff? You have more liquidity chasing the same number of houses. House prices go up. It creates a massive financial boom. We know what happened from the 90s onwards. That boom ends up taking over the whole global economy, creating massive economic growth and prosperity for lots of different people. But ultimately, that was unsustainable. And in the process, you have this beast of debt that is released. And debt is a really powerful disciplining tool for people. Because, on the one hand, you might have some assets, but on the other hand, you now have to manage your liabilities as well. So if you're relatively wealthy, then you always make sure that, you try and have more equity, say, in your home than your liabilities. You kind of manage your debt and your assets. You're a good kind of mini capitalist who makes very healthy financial decisions. But if you're not paid very well, you might find that suddenly the value of your liabilities is higher than the value of your assets. And instead of saying, oh, well, you're not being paid a high enough wage to be able to afford the things that you need to survive, people will instead say, you've been irresponsible. You've made bad financial decisions, and that's how you've got yourself into debt, even though they'd taken out the debt just to be able to pay for things they needed to survive. So it's, you internalize that. You think, I'm a failure because I'm in debt. You don't think, I need to organize with people to try and have a higher wage. And actually today, financial issues are driving a lot of people, particularly young men, to self-harm and suicide because they internalize that blame. They think it's my fault.
Because they look at the lifestyle of the top guy who seems to be so clever, and in a very, very interesting way for men, that means he's very masculine,
yes.
right? He managed to succeed and become the best hunter in the tribe, right? And I'm not able to do this. So it's not just that I'm not able financially. It's basically an identity issue that would lead to that. It's quite interesting as well when you it doesn't matter, as a matter of fact, if you're gaining capital, in your assets that you bought in debt. I think the sentence that you said there, which is so interesting, is debt is a very powerful disciplinary instrument. So in where I grew up in, a developing economy, you keep the people busy with football and putting bread on the table, right? In more advanced economies like here, I think the idea is, if you had given people enough, which was really what was happening post-World War II with the, baby boomers creating so much GDP, it seems that in my mind, that basically meant they had so much time to start pondering stuff that could actually harm the government, interestingly, or the top players, right? Or the ones that the government works for, really. And in an interesting way, to keep people busy, then student loans, other loans, mortgages, car loans, and everything becomes, the shackles that basically keep us restrained. I have to say, I've never really discussed this in public. Maybe we should have it over coffee, but I'll ask you anyway. One of my experiences, which most people have never had, is I was witness, because of my position at Google and because of, at the time, and because of my history of being a very prominent businessman in the Middle East for a long time. So I was very much entangled into what was happening with the Arab Spring. Not that I had any views on it, because I had not lived in my home country, Egypt, for maybe 20 years at the time. But, I'd been in a position of, I know the internet really well, so almost everyone was constantly reaching out to me, the previous government, the transition government, the opposition. Everyone was just talking to me all the time, saying what's happening, right? And I have to admit, in my mind, I think the Arab Spring seems to have been a glitch in the system, where somehow, because Arabs at the time were so offline, if you want, you gave them a tiny bit of online community, and suddenly they go like, this is shit, right? And they organize and they explode, okay? And I have to say, I feel that leading after the Arab Spring into 2019, 2020, you could see quite a bit of organized opposition around the world, Hong Kong, here in the UK, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that this is the reason for COVID. I'm not into that conspiracy at all, okay? And I know you wrote about, the COVID economy, if you want. But it seems to me that somehow governments found a massive opportunity to say, okay, everyone stay home, right? Let's not organize in the streets anymore, no more Arab Spring. And you could actually recognize very quickly that post-COVID, everyone's silent. Everyone's like, yeah, what was that? Right? And let's talk about that era a little bit. No conspiracy theory here. But two things happened with COVID. One is actually society at large was disciplined.
Yes.
Everyone was ordered to sit home. Nobody had freedom to do anything. But at the same time, massive amounts of money were funneled into the system through printing money, basically more debt, right? And I think that completely shifted. I think this was the one big nail in the coffin of freedom, if you think about it. What do you think of that?
I think, that is a very interesting and well thought through analysis, because you're right, it's not conspiratorial to say that governments in particular, but also big multinational corporations, took advantage of a crisis to strengthen their position. And you see this happening over and over and over again. You know, Naomi Klein talks about the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism, the way in which the powerful are able to take advantage of moments of crisis and uncertainty to embed and strengthen their control. One example that she uses, which I find really fascinating, is the example of the tsunami and the crisis and devastation that took place in the Maldives, and the way in which that was used to remove people who had been living on the islands in the Maldives for a very, very long time, settle them all in a very, very small area of the capital, and ultimately sell those islands off to big hotels so that they would become centers for, you know, luxury tourism, basically. Yeah. Now, no one's saying the government caused that natural disaster, but they took advantage of it to basically kind of redistribute power and wealth within that economy. And I think that you can say the same about the pandemic, and that takes place both within individual societies and at the level of the world economy. Now, you mentioned there, having been born in the Middle East and been a businessman in the Middle East for a while, and that idea of debt as a disciplining tool resonates with you. Now, you can see that at the level of kind of individual consumers, but you can also see that at the level of whole states.
Nations at large, exactly. Of course.
So the name for my book, Vulture Capitalism, comes from this vulture fund, basically, which was just after the 2008 financial crisis. Zambia, which is a relatively small African nation, big copper producer, had nothing to do with the financial crisis, but because of the collapse in world GDP after 2008, copper prices fell, its export revenues kind of dried up, and its debts started to look unsustainable. So there was an Irish fund that bought Zambia's debt, knowing that Zambia was going to default on that debt, so that it could sue the government of Zambia for failing to pay its debts and take vast amounts of money out of the pockets of ordinary Zambians and suck it back into the rich world. Now, this is the kind of what you might call kind of lawfare. It's like warfare using international legal systems that you see all the time in the world economy. And debt is a very powerful tool for basically crushing entire nations, and particularly nations where you're beginning to see some resistance to the dynamics of global capitalism. And I think you're quite right that we did start to see that in a really big way before the pandemic. I think part of the reason for that was that we were moving from a unipolar world into a multipolar world. Now, you can say whatever you want about the dynamics that underpin that, but ultimately, when you have two superpowers, all the other countries in the world economy have a little bit more leverage, a little bit more room, basically, because they're able to choose. Play them. Yeah. Exactly. Pit them off against each other. Before, it was the Washington Consensus, which is, you follow the rules laid out by Washington, or you don't get any money and you're kind of ostracized from the world economy. Now these countries have more than one superpower to pick from. They can maybe go to China if they want lending for infrastructure. That's going to come with a lot of strings attached and a lot of problems, but ultimately there is this choice. Now, what you see over the course of the pandemic is a lot of nations being really kind of beaten down using the tool of debt, because a lot of countries, as soon as the pandemic hit, basically found themselves unable to repay their debts through no fault of their own. The global economy had been shut down. The factories that were using the resources that they were exporting were no longer operating. Suddenly they were unable to pay their debts. We had a debt moratorium, so a pause on debt repayments, but the debts themselves
kept increasing because of interest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that has continued to this day, except for the fact that it's getting worse because of climate breakdown. So you see, natural disasters, cyclones, hurricanes. We've just seen in the Caribbean recently that caused massive devastation. And Caribbean nations come forward and say, we as the international community have agreed that small island countries at risk of desertification, all of these problems that are going to come from climate breakdown, we shouldn't be the only ones that have to bear the burden of climate breakdown. So we would like some of these debts that we're going to have to take out to reconstruct after this natural disaster that we didn't cause, that basically you in the global north caused. We're going to ask for some grace on that debt. And what they get is so tiny, it's barely enough to allow them to recover, let alone put in place the conditions for sustainable long-term economic growth.
It's, again, I will probably repeat your sentence for a very long time. It's a disciplinary instrument, right? So the idea of the fact that someone can go to Zambia and take out, literally, imagine walking into a country and taking $10 out of every citizen.
Yes.
When their income is $2 a month, right? How evil is that when you really think about it? But that's not the issue. The issue is that is used to discipline a country so that they follow the agenda and become a peasant as a country, right? And I think the idea of how the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and so on, and the IMF and so on, basically used that instrument in favor of Western agendas. It's not a secret now. I think in the last year, a lot more truth coming out about how many decisions globally that would benefit the entire world would be vetoed because of Western interests sometimes, or because of a certain nation's interest. And basically, those instruments then put the entire country and its leaders under pressure to comply.
Yes.
Right? The thing that kills me, though, and you repeated it several times, is that Thatcher would then promise freedom.
Yeah.
That Reagan would promise prosperity. That, the IMF would promise reform. That it's almost consistent that what the promise is the opposite of the objective. That you're walking in to sort of break down unions and the very, very final bit of freedom that the worker has, and you're promising the worker freedom.
It's very skillful the way they do that. And I think it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about how alluring this promise of freedom is. And the allure of that promise comes from, again, it's the American dream. It's like, sure, they're promising freedom, and that freedom's going to come with inequality. It means that we're going to have a market, basically. Some people are going to rise to the top and some people are going to fall to the bottom. But we all convince ourselves, I'm effective, I'm talented, I'm resourceful. Why should I not be able to rise to the top and achieve things and become a millionaire within this system and within this economy? And I think in some ways it speaks to the fact that we all know that we as individuals and groups have immense skills and capabilities and talents that are constantly being exploited by someone else and taken advantage of by someone else.
Which, by the way, is the actual, definition of capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
It's basically, everyone is a commodity. Let's just buy them for the lowest possible price to produce for the capitalist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And because we know that we have these talents and skills that are being exploited by someone else, we're sucked in by this idea that if all the external stuff is taken out of the way, then we will rise to the top. The problem is that the whole game is rigged. As I said, there's this class of people who are insulated from markets, basically, because they're, in monopolies or they're working within governments to kind of get their own way. And then even, within this hierarchy, there's a brilliant statistic from Oxfam that says that 1/3 of billionaire wealth is inherited and 1/3 of billionaire wealth comes from crony connections to government. So basically, 2/3 of billionaire wealth comes from either inheritance or corruption. So the idea of the self-made billionaire is just kind of absurd. That other third, it comes from exploiting workers, exploiting the environment. God knows the privileges that we afford to billionaires because we basically say, well, they have all the wealth, we better give them what they want. And it really brings home this point that the freedom that you're promised is really the freedom to kind of be exploited. unless you are one of those very few lucky people who is basically able to adopt a position at the top of this hierarchy and sit around making rules for everyone else. I think there's another point here that you mentioned earlier, which was about the implications of this for people's understanding of their own masculinity and identity, right? Because if you buy into this philosophy for understanding the world, which is that, you know, life is a market, there's a clear hierarchy, the capable ones go to the top and the useless ones sink to the bottom. But you aren't aware of the fact that this game is rigged, that actually it's not the good that get to the top, it's the lucky that get to the top, and they stay at the top.
Or the one of the team, basically.
Yes, exactly.
If you align with the team at the top, then you get to the top.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And people at the top never fall down to the bottom.
Yeah.
That's a key thing about social mobility. It's not just that those at the bottom are able to go up if they're effective. It should also mean that if you're very wealthy and capable and you fail, that you should fall to the bottom.
You shouldn't be bailed out.
Do you ever see that happening?
Exactly.
Absolutely not. So if you don't understand that this game is rigged, you internalize those feelings of shame and powerlessness, and you think, I'm not a millionaire, so I must be worthless. You know, I've been working really hard, but I'm not succeeding. That must mean that I am not intelligent, that I'm not capable. And you see, I think, particularly among young men today, where the idea of masculinity is, as you say, tied to your ability to provide, to have a home, to have a good salary, to feel secure, to be able to provide a sense of security.
Yeah.
And you are unable to do that because we live in an economy that kind of manufactures insecurity as a way of exploiting people. You feel like a failure. And your response to that could be a number of different things. It could be that you feel hopeless and depressed. And that's definitely something that we're seeing with the rise of severe mental ill health. But it could also make you very angry.
Correct.
It can make you feel like you want to burn the whole system down, like the only reason you're not getting to the top is because there's people in your way. It's the women, the feminists, or it's the migrants and the refugees who are getting in your way.
Which we can see so much noise around now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that response to this competitive, hierarchical, individualistic culture that we've created makes us sick, or it makes us angry, and it makes society sick. And we've just seen that with the riots that we've had across this country.
And of course, that's playing to the agenda of what is the design in the first place.
Exactly.
It's like, yeah, let the you know, the savages sort of, you know, mingle among themselves and fight and disagree and, you know, and comment badly on each other's social media posts. Let them never get together and say, it's the whole game design that's working against me. Fascinating. What do we do?
I'm glad you asked. I think you're exactly right that this division and this individualism plays into the agenda that we're kind of all playing under. Because the narrative of those at the top is ordinary people are too stupid or too selfish to be trusted with any real political power. We have to have all the power up here, because if we really had a democratic economy, if we gave workers power in their workplaces, if we gave communities power, then they would abuse it. And what's the evidence for this? Well, it's people's response to living in a competitive, individualistic society where they're encouraged to fight one another, and they do fight one another. And then because they're fighting one another, those at the top say, you don't deserve power, you have to be controlled and policed, right? And actually, there is another way. So throughout history, across time, across space, there are constant examples of people coming together, doing that thing that I mentioned earlier of recognizing that they have these skills and capabilities that are being exploited by someone else. But instead of trying to use those skills to compete against each other, they pool their capabilities and they come together and they cooperate and they build movements or institutions or organizations that become really powerful and influential. And the example I like to use, because I think it's a really good contrast with the example of Boeing, is the example of the Lucas Plan in the UK. Now, you might not have heard of this. Lucas Aerospace was an aerospace company in the UK in the 1970s. And it came into all sorts of difficulties because rising competition from abroad, the workers were unionized, they were paid higher wages, so it wasn't competitive. And the workers went to the Labour government at the time and said, we need you to nationalise us because, otherwise the firm's going to go under and we're going to all lose our jobs. But Tony Benn, who is my personal political hero, a democratic socialist, replied to the workers, why don't you come up with a plan as to how you can save this corporation? And so the unionists went back to the workers, and initially they tried to ask all sorts of experts and academics how they could design a plan to transform this company. That didn't work very well. So instead, they asked all the workers in the company, all of these engineers, all of these, people in various different positions throughout the company to provide ideas as to how they could change it. And what they put together became known as the Lucas Plan. And these workers had basically taken stock of the resources within the firm. And they had said, rather than producing weapons, which is what they were producing at the time, they said, we can use this organization to produce socially useful technologies that will be of benefit to society. So things like wind turbines, healthcare tech, kidney dialysis machines. This was in the 1970s, so it's very forward thinking. And here's a plan as to how we can get there. They were saying, there's layers of management that are telling us how to do our jobs and what to do. We don't really need that. We can work together and manage ourselves. We can have a democratic, publicly owned company where, there are worker representatives making decisions, where there's, political representation, societal representation, so that we can have this company that produces socially useful technologies. And this plan was greeted by everyone as this amazing thing. Everyone on the left was like, this is brilliant. But even like the Financial Times was like, wow, this is a really powerful document. We had no idea that workers had so many ideas, so many capabilities, so many resources that they could use in imagining a different kind of world. And it became a kind of lightning rod for activists everywhere. Ultimately, the guy who spearheaded these efforts, Mike Cooley, was fired for his union activity. And he ended up going to work at the GLC, the Greater London Corporation, which I was talking about earlier. And he was put in charge of their kind of community technology outreach. And this was a mechanism for bringing together businesses, community organisers and local government to say, what technologies can we develop that will help your community, that will help your business? How can we kind of create a supportive environment for you to be able to live better lives, basically, and using the power of local government to be able to do that? Now, Thatcher crushed the unions and Lucas went under. Thatcher crushed the GLC and the GLC went under. And what I think is really fascinating is that Lucas Aerospace shut down. It was carved up in the shareholder value revolution of the 1980s, sold from one company to another. And parts of what was once Lucas Aerospace ended up being purchased by a corporation that produced the faulty sensors that went into the Boeing 737 MAX planes that crashed, killing all of those people. And I think that provides us a very clear indication of the choice that we have in terms of the kind of economy that we create. On the one hand, we have workers coming together to produce socially useful technologies that are of benefit to society. On the other hand, we have a massive monopolistic corporation working with an imperial government to produce planes that fall out of the sky.
Wow. Wow. It fascinates me because, again, if you would look at East and West, the way we create barriers between people to work together while saying that this is for their benefit is really what's killing everyone.
Yeah.
I mean, in a very interesting way, when the 2008 crisis hit the world, my home country, where I was born, Egypt, was unaffected because we didn't have any debt instruments at all. It wasn't part of the economy for us to borrow to buy anything, right? We borrowed from friends when we needed money. We borrowed from family members and then paid back and so on. And so the crisis hits, we're unaffected. right? When you really think of the evolution of how the Egyptian society for many, many years, we didn't have pensions, we didn't have health care, we didn't have anything, right? But we had a community. And the community was basically saying, if my cousin is in trouble, I'll help them out. There is no need for insurance for that because my cousin will help me out if I'm in trouble. Okay? And I see more and more now as I go to Egypt that this is disappearing, that debt is everywhere, right? That everyone is now trying to say externalize the dependencies outside the community to others.
Yes.
And that basically is the beginning of where everyone is as we are. So what you're saying is the answer to all of this is don't count on the government, don't count on the capitalist system, connect and create a community so that you, as the people, actually govern your own life.
Exactly.
I will end it here. I think this, I admire your thinking. I think you're fascinating. I think you're really on a very important mission, and I really support what you're doing.
Thank you so much,
grateful
Mo.
that you came
It's
today.
been such a pleasure talking with you. It's been really fantastic. Thank you for everything you do.
Yeah, for all of you listening, I am so grateful for the opportunity, as I always say, to speak to amazing people because of you. This is my episode before last, before I take a break on Slow Mo. I will leave the entire body of work for you to revisit. With so many incredible speakers and so many incredible thinkers. So you have 320 episodes to go back and listen to. Meanwhile, I think this message truly is probably the core of what Slow Mo is all about, okay? That what we need as people is to realize that most of the time what we're told is not for our benefit, it's for our belief so that the benefit of someone else is delivered, and that the true benefit is for us to organize together. The true benefit, if we wanted to create the world that we want, is to create it ourselves, is to stop playing to the narratives and actually connect to others. I love you all for listening, and I will see you next time.